Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of a monthly podcast series between me, John Hayes, the managing partner of Constantine Law, an employment and regulatory firm based in London, and Amanda Rajkumar, who is one of the highest profile UK Chief Human Resources Officer. Her experience spans global brands such as JP Morgan, BNP Paribas, at Adidas, and now she's at a boardroom level of Great Ormond Street Hospital. So together we want to have a discussion on some of the really hard issues facing the UK workplace, impacting on both employers and employees, and bring two worlds together. Those are both law and leadership, to see whether we can come up with some practical solutions to some of the biggest issues facing the UK workplace today. Amanda, morning, how are you?
Good morning, John. I'm fine. How are you doing?
This is the first of a series of podcasts which we are recording for the legal and HR community, and we thought we should get, dare we say it, a leading employment lawyer and a very senior Chief Human Resources Officer to speak on workplace issues. What do you think about that, Amanda?
I think it's a match made in heaven, John. Yeah, I think there's so many topics at the moment that are highly relevant for both of our professions, and I think there are more topics without solutions. And I think having this discussion both from an employment law viewpoint and also from more of I would say, a leadership HR perspective, I think we can bring a lot of light on some of these topics, and also potentially even some solutions around how employers and employees can move forward on some of these thorny issues that we are battling with at the moment.
I agree, and I think we're going to deal with one of the thorniest issues that's facing the UK workplace as a whole in a moment. And just for those listening, this is the first in a series of podcasts that Amanda and I intend to record over the months and potentially, if she puts up with me, years to come. So look, we're going to speak this morning, and we were going to speak about this anyway because Amanda suggested this to me as the biggest workplace issue, I think, confronting the UK today, which is burnout in the workplace. And then a major report landed this week on this very issue. So Amanda, let me ask you first, and then I'll introduce the report. Why did you want to speak about this? Why did you think that this was and is such a massive issue within the UK workplace?
Well, personally, from a HR perspective, actually HR burnout is on the increase, and then when we think about general stress in the workplace, burnout is not a buzzword anymore. It's a symptom of something I think that's really broken in our workplace system, and so the Mayfield report and the Keep Britain Working report I think are both extremely relevant, really, really timely, because what they're telling us is that there are a very strong employer considerations that need to be looked at to be able to get Britain back on its feet again. But I would also say, John, I mean, of course, I've got my HR hat on here, and it does concern me that we're at the lowest lack of engagement amongst HR professionals. But we play a huge role in helping prevent burnout in the workplace. So we've got to kind of, we talk a lot about putting your gas mask on first before you help others, but literally you've got to do it at the same time here, because I think burnout is that chronic stress that's gone unmanaged, and it's a really kind of invisible tax that people are paying to just keep up with the workplace.
Yeah, and I agree. And so let's introduce the Mayfield report now. It was actually the main item on the news agenda this Wednesday on Bonfire Night, and I am just reading some of the summaries of that report now, just by way of background to people listening to this podcast. Charlie Mayfield is the former head of John Lewis. He was approached by the government to do a major independent review of the reasons for the chronic levels of workplace absences within the UK workplace. The UK currently has higher numbers of in-work of benefits claimants of people of a working age, I think that's between 18 and 65, of any of our major Western competitors, nations. So that would be Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the UK has the highest rate of in-work sickness absence. And the question is, why is that? And it's, creating a massive drain on resources for employers, and it's a real lag and drag on competitiveness for the UK's GDP. But it's also a massive issue for the people concerned as well. And I know that often you're trying to resolve those very people-centric issues in the workplace as the CHRO, Amanda.
Yeah, no, totally. And the fact that, sickness levels are 10% higher before pandemic is really, I think, jaw-dropping. And as you talk about this continual high level of burnout, and also we know it's usually down to two key factors: stress, burnout, or musculoskeletal issues. So I think this is definitely something we aim to try and solve a little bit today, give some solutions around. But I think it's I think this is now the time where we have to kind of not only at this introduction of the report, but also really give some tangible solutions around this. But I think it would be probably quite interesting, John, to work out, where's this come from? How did we kind of get here to this situation, which is worse than it was a pandemic? And one of the things that we've talked about recently is why is Britain the kind of the Europe sick man, as you mentioned, or sick person, as you mentioned? Because for me, illness is not just physical; it's organizational. We talk a lot about the system of the organization, and I think honestly, one of the causes, I think, of how we've got here is that we've normalized pressure as performance and the continual pressure. And I hope I'm not causing people on this podcast who are listening to this to think, oh, she's so airy fairy, but I think we have got to a stage where people after COVID learnt a different way of working, which was more in line with being able to manage certain aspects of their life as well as perform. We're now pushing people back in the office, John, and I think we are putting much more pressure on people. And the fact that there are 5,000 new long-term sickness claims every single day in the UK, I think is staggering, and I think we have to analyse it. I mean, what I would say is I think most people don't want to be off work, but they just can't afford to keep going at this rate of pressure. I'm going to stop for a minute and get your reaction on that.
So I agree with that. I mean, I think the quote was over 85 billion a sickness bill. That was what was reported by the BBC, and I think that Charlie Mayfield has been doing the rounds on the radio effectively on behalf of the government. I mean, this is something that's been nagging at me for a long time, because I act for predominantly employers, but often employees as well. And so the bigger kind of existential question for me is, what is the UK workplace doing wrong that means that fewer levels of people, statistically fewer levels of working age people, want to work in the UK than they might do in Germany, France, Netherlands, etc. And so perhaps towards the end of this podcast, we can begin to put some solutions together. But I'm just going to summarise some of what Charlie Mayfield said, if I can speak for a minute or two on that. Yeah. He did talk about putting in place workplace health provision, and that would have 4 separate strands. And I've got a large number of medium-sized and small employer clients, and some very large clients will have very sophisticated occupational health schemes, but a lot of medium-sized employers will not have that. And this report makes it clear that it is for employers to pay for all of this stuff. And this is a government report, so we know that is what the government thinks. The government has mandated Charlie Mayfield effectively to come to this conclusion. As soon as I say that, and any employer and HRO listening to this will groan, because they'll think, well, we've had all of this other stuff that we've had to assimilate, be it national insurance rises, we're going to have the employment rights bill, we've got all of this other stuff, we've got the budget coming in 3 weeks, and now we're going to have to potentially assimilate all of this as well. And so before I just come to summarise that, I just wonder what you thought about the appetite for employers to assimilate further costs and responsibilities to deal with workplace sickness absences above and beyond what they already have.
Look, I think it's a pardon the pun, but it's a bitter pill to swallow. But I actually think it's needed. I've actually worked in environments where we've had occupational nurses on site, and I've also had environments where we don't have occupational health departments. And certainly, I have seen quick remediation, expediency of cases that can be dealt with occupational provisions. And I do think having a nurse on site or a GP on site can help those kind of topics, but it's hugely expensive. And you're absolutely right, medium-sized companies, SMEs, I mean, it's a non-negotiable. But the requirement is there to have a much better retention of physical working and mental health conditions of neurodivergent employees, for instance, helping people stay in the workplace longer for those who are older, and of course help for the people with disabilities as well. So it's very, very clear. But John, I think it will be a further, let's say, burden or responsibility for employers to think about. However, without having employees there, they're also going to be an issue. And one thing I'd like to pick up on, which I think is pretty important, is why are we here at this time? And you mentioned this at your intro. And I do think there is an angle around hybrid. Now, it's not specific to the UK, so I can't say it's only for the UK. I think these are other countries. Having recently worked in Germany, we had some of that as well. But I think hybrid working has made it much harder for line managers to be able to manage cases of stress and burnout. They're not physically in proximity with their employees. They don't read the soft intelligence around situations. And I think hybrid work has been an exacerbator, in fact, of burnout, as opposed to an enabler of more engagement and better working conditions. So I do think that's something we can't brush over. And as time goes on and more people are being asked to go back to the office, it'll be very interesting to see how rates of sickness continue, or if they're not affected at all. It'll be really interesting to see it, though.
I think that's a very insightful comment, because I think statistically we do have the highest levels of hybrid working within any major European economy. I think that is a fact. And you have just linked the fact that as a country we have the highest levels of hybrid working to the highest levels of in-work sickness absence. So is that a feature? I think it may be a little bit more nuanced than that, because if offices were the panacea, I've always said to my employer clients, if offices were the panacea of all employment issues, then I certainly would be out of a job, because there would be no workplace disputes, and without any workplace disputes, you can't fund the wonderful services of employment lawyers, which everyone loves to do. So I think there has to be a nuanced approach to that. I'm just going to briefly summarise now some of the recommendations, the hard recommendations that Charlie Mayfield suggest. I've got two screens here, so if people are watching this online, they'll see me turn to my right. But they talk about 4 strands of workplace health provision, WHP, to deal with long-term sick. So that's to design in-work rehabilitation and re-engagement plan, and a link to clinical care and prepare for work. I think that's elements of what you were talking about, that the designing of in-work rehabilitation plans that may require some form of occupational health in the form of nurses and other professionals, but it might be psychologists as well. There's healthy in work, which is to monitor health and well-being activity early to prevent issues, ensure success through appropriate adjustments, and provide advice and support. I think that's a really interesting but potentially controversial recommendation. I'll come back to that. The third element is in work with a health condition. So I think that's to develop stay in work plans and support agreement and implementation of reasonable adjustments. So that is for those who have a pre-existing diagnosed condition. That is the in work with health condition. But as you said, an increasing number of people have in work registered conditions because they are there's an increasing recognition of neurodiversity. And then there's dealing with sickness absence, to engage with employee and assess readiness to work, support the development of return to work plans. So all of those 4 areas touch on the overlap, which is why we wanted to deal with this podcast, between what a CHRO is required to do, what support they may want from an employment lawyer at times, what businesses are obliged or will be under this plan obliged to do, and the impact on employees. So talk to me about how you've designed in the past in-house rehabilitation and re-engagement plans. I found that really interesting, the fact that you have worked on the ground with professionals to encourage people back to work.
Yeah. Look, I think the first thing is that understanding what the condition is. So there has to be obviously a willingness for employees to feel that they can talk to HR. And, I was on an event last week where we were talking with employees and they were just saying, well, I don't feel I can go to HR. And so firstly, we have to have that as a baseline, that there is an open door and that there is a receptive, accessible support system with your HRBP. So I think firstly that conversation about what is the illness and what are the provisions potentially needed. And in fact, in my last workplace, even before the individual came to HR, they would often go straight directly to occupational health and have a conversation about the provisions, both physical or even notional, that were required for that individual to be able to do their best work. And of course, there has to be a timeline put in place, progress, and also kind of two-way conversations around mitigating circumstances, and why there has to be also a clear briefing to the line manager about how they also fit into that three-way relationship. So that works quite well if you can have that open conversation and you have those resources. I can imagine where the challenge is going to come, John, in much smaller companies where they may have one HR person for the whole organization, and having to give this tailored service to employees for individual needs is going to be much more challenging. And I think that's definitely one big topic. The other thing I think, though, we can cover some of this with is, I think it was your second point, about having a very strong understanding about workplace morale and how people are feeling generally. And most companies have some kind of survey, employee engagement survey, a kind of a pulse check. And I think this is a really good way of being able to get a gauge. It's a data point, right, on how the environment is feeling, dependent on participation rates of those kind of workforce surveys. But I mean, I can see maybe you're looking a bit cynical at this, but individuals who, my experience has been, individuals who are unhappy in the workplace tend to fill those in. The ones that are happy don't. And I think it is a voice that we need to listen to as HR professionals and as leaders generally. So I do think we also have that as a usual baseline, but I think then comes the more tailored approach for individual cases, if we are aware of them. And that's also a key thing. Do you feel comfortable speaking to individuals at work about it?
I think that's a very good idea. I mean, it's outrageous to accuse a lawyer of ever being cynical, Amanda. But I mean, how dare you? And I never looked at this report with a remotely jaundiced eye on behalf of employers. But I think you're right in terms of, because by and large you've worked at large employers, and so you've seen very best practice deployed, but then you've worked at organisations that have had, frankly, the resources to deploy best practice, and now you're working, if I could, at Gosh, one of the leading children as a non-executive director, I think, and what the leading children or paediatric hospital in the UK. So you see best practice there. I think employers, medium-sized and smaller employers, could do with learning some of the relatively low-cost but smarter tricks of the trade deployed by some of the big practices. So if I take my unjaundiced lenses off, I think that is right to say, okay, monitoring health and well-being could mean sending around surveys. Most small and medium-sized employers either never do that, or they do it very, very infrequently. And so if that's an early warning sign, I mean, I think if you look at some of this, the healthy and work point, you're right, that's the second point. Some of it raises some interesting questions about where the employer's obligation begins and ends. So you can read some of this and is what the government saying that there needs to be mandatory? I'll raise some controversial questions. Drug testing in the workplace, alcohol testing in the workplace. How mandatory does an employer have to be in terms of testing its workforce's ability to work? And so, and again, that's not just drug and alcohol testing, but it could be, some employees will find it very difficult to face intrusive questions around their neurodiversity and issues like that, because health is the most private of all matters that all of us guard very jealously. So I think it's a really interesting, it's a practical issue, but it's also a privacy and philosophical issue as to how intrusive an employer can be in this area. What do you think about that? Because you've dealt face to face with more employees than I have over the years.
Yeah, I think, the days of drug testing are kind of long gone. I mean, obviously, I kind of grew up in the late 90s in investment banking, and before anyone joined, you had to have a mandatory drug test, and then of course, as people became regulated, it was even more important. But by the time I was in the US, before I moved to my last role in Germany, and we actually phased out a mandatory drug testing for new hires because we never found any cases of drug use, so blatant drug use. So I think, we're in a different place as a society, but I also think to have started at Gosh and been asked to do a drug test or an alcohol test, well, alcohol I think is okay, but the drug test, I think, I think I would have been a bit offended. So I think we've moved on, and I think that is definitely feels too intrusive. However, if an employee was working and seemed to be under the influence of something, it was debilitating in some way or affecting their work performance, then I think we would be within our rights to ask for that. Now, when it comes to this topic of sickness, absence, and well-being, it's one, I think, I don't know, I think it's one it's worth discussing a bit, because I'm not sure where the evasiveness, the invasion, I should say, is warranted when this individual probably has a GP and is under some kind of care from a social service setting anyway. So I think unless it's affecting their work and it's very obvious, I'm not sure that would have a very relevant place now. But we were going to see as these things get rolled out, right?
Yeah, I'm just interested to see where these are big picture recommendations by Charlie Mayfield, but where they draw the line. I think in the third area, in work with a health condition, I think those are it's probably easier for senior human resources people to design in work, stay at work plans, because there's already going to be evidence of someone with a pre-existing condition, so they're going to have evidence of that, of some form of medical records for that person. So I'll kind of skip over that, because that's the kind of obligation to deal with reasonable adjustments, which all employers already have. But then, in relation to sickness absence, which is what really prompted this report, the fact that the cost on the UK exchequer and the drag on competitiveness, those are some of the hardest issues, aren't they? Because once someone gets signed off sick for a long time, it can be difficult to get them to get back to work, and then the impact on people who are staying behind and potentially having to pick up that person's work can be quite acute as well. I mean, talk to me about that, about what you've seen in terms of dealing with knotty long-term sickness absences.
Look, I've seen both sides. I've had employees in my own team occasionally over the last 30 years who have had long-term sick, and there is, of course, a huge duty of care from an employer. But I've also seen what happens to the team at large. And if I just think about this one example, it means you don't often have the budget to be able to get a temporary worker in to cover the sickness time. You obviously then have to reroute duties and work to be done to other people. So that invariably increases other people's workload. And it can create some bad feeling, John. I mean, it does. And there's a resentfulness. By the way, not too dissimilar from back in the day when women were going on parental leave. There used to be a bit of a begrudgedness around that. So it's not so dissimilar. But I think there is more understanding post-COVID. I don't know if I'm wrong. I sense that people understand there are things like long COVID, and that people need to have time off. But I think what I've also seen on the other side, though, is sometimes employees who are ill and are isolated, it becomes harder to get back into the workplace, both from a feeling of a confidence perspective, but also, well, maybe I should take some more weeks off. And we know that statutory sick pay is not particularly incentivized for people to stay off. It's one of the worst. So people staying off for real, real reasons. And I think that's also something we have to consider. Is it easy to do a fit note self-certificate? Yes, it is. And are doctors willing to sign off? Well, I think they have quite a lot of risk on their side, so they must listen to the employee. So I think there are those factors going on as well. But I also think there is little control the employer has on this topic. And I think it has been like that for many, many years. All we can do is support from a distance, and make sure that we keep in regular contact without harassing, obviously, but also making sure that we help individuals come back with phased returns, with a supportive way, and being there for them. And I think that would be the right CHRO approach. But don't get me wrong, it's not all rosy and kind of all well-meaning. I do see how there are tension points and flex points around all of these aspects.
So I'm going to ask you in a minute for your solutions, but I'm just going to read for 30 seconds what Charlie Mayfield recommends, because some employers might listen to this and shudder, but this is the direction of travel. So they say, how will it be funded? We think the workplace health provision, WHP, needs to be flexible, market-led solution, with employers funding the provision, and choosing certified providers that meet their needs. Providers will be assessed against national standards. It's our view that employers need to be responsible for funding the WHP. Direct public delivery, i.e. through the NHS, risks both inefficiency and crowding out. Many employers, particularly SMEs, struggle with the capital, time and knowledge needed to invest in workplace health. Costs are frequently higher for smaller employers, that's true, arising from relatively larger administrative burden to providers. In the vanguard phase, it's a defined term, don't know what it means, but in the vanguard phase, we propose the exploration of pooling mechanisms to reduce costs and create economies of scale, particularly for SMEs. So I'm not sure what that means, but that is the direction of travel by the government. And I think it's about maybe having a local or regional pool of experts, whether those are health providers or senior HR people who people may not be able to have ready access to, but they can buy on an hourly basis. I don't know. What do you think if you had to design this?
I don't know. I don't. Yeah. I don't know. I guess we will have to see what they recommend in more detail. But I don't see a pooling working. I think these are really confidential issues that I think if it's an occupational health company, I could see that being seeing as a pooled resource and offering to many clients. But yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, they don't give that many solutions, to be honest. I mean, it's more setting out the problems in this report. But I think there are some things that we can look at, if you don't mind me moving on to that now, John. And I think HR as a sector can't wait for the law to catch up. I think that would be crazy. And I think we need to start redesigning work now a little bit. Now, that sounds all a bit newfangled. I don't think so. But what I mean is, I think we have to help line managers be much more aware of what's happening with their people. They can't just manage performance, but they need to actually notice what's happening with their employees. And again, remote work doesn't help this, but this is something because burnout doesn't happen overnight, John. As you know, it grows, and there is a lot of I'm fine and yeah, I'm well and I'm getting on with it. But sometimes people aren't saying that, and I think that well-being is not something that can sit in a soft column anymore. It needs to be, something that we're helping line managers spot quicker. We give them clear techniques to be able to deal with sickness and absence. So there will be some reworking of that. And I think that at the most senior levels, wellness of employees should be a standing board agenda item. It's not just only profits. And I know that might sound a bit left wing, John, but I honestly believe that the engagement and wellness of employees is intrinsically linked to in performance. And there's loads of reports to show it that. So I think that's something. And if I think about my own time coming up in, quite a kind of burnout decade during the late 90s and early noughties. I mean, I was at JP Morgan at the time, and we often talked about sustainable output. So it's not just about, fulfilling all the to-do tasks you've got, an endless grind, but it's also about making sure that you're working in a smart way. And so I think that mindset also is something we've forgotten along the way as well. And I think this is something that we've seen in.
You go. Let me make one interjection, and then we'll wrap up in a minute. I think those are two great practical examples there about equipping line managers, possibly with a template about how to spot burnout, because at the moment they might be so focused on their particular deliverables, whatever the deliverable that is, that they are not either trained or equipped to spot employee wellbeing issues. They're not incentivized to spot employee wellbeing issues, and so I think they will need training from people like you to do that. I think the idea about a wellbeing audit or standard being a board requirement is if they're going to make this serious and going to make this teeth, then they're going to have to do that. They're going to have to hold boards to account, and they're going to say effectively the corollary of what you're saying is, all right, if your level of sickness, absence, or potentially even your level of attrition, the amount that you're losing people, because that's often a sign of unhappiness, is over a certain level, then there could be consequences in relation to that. My idea is that if you're going to ask employers to fund this WHP, which they are, there should be some incentive to do that. So if you're going to put this in place and employers are going to own this as a societal issue, then there would have to be something like a reduction in corporation tax from 25 to 24 or 23% in return for good provision of these types of services. You're able to deduct the cost of this healthcare provision from your corporation tax or whatever that is. There's going to have to be some recognition that rather than just Mayfield saying, right, you have to pay for this, this is another thing for you to pay for. You won't get employer buy-in if you do that, if it's another thing they have to do. So you will have to say, okay, that we're going to incentivize you to do this in some way. And I think if there's an understanding that it's a kind of three-way collective issue between what the government wants, what employers want and need, because they will benefit from employees being back at work, and for the benefit of the workforce as a whole, because however many employers there are always more employees, then I think that you could see some kind of joined up solutions on that basis. I'll ask you for your concluding thoughts now.
Yeah. No, I think this is going to be a topic we should probably revisit in a year to see, what's changed, what's happened. I mean, where we are. I think the workplace it's always been a place of pressure, but I think it's got worse with low growth in the UK, for instance, at the moment. I think there is a lot going on. There's, quiet cracking. So people are at work, coming to work, but are sometimes burnt out, and there's the small signs out there. HR certainly hasn't been looking for that. We've been focused on performance outcomes and also on retention rates, or even hiring, time to hire. We do need to look at engagement in a different way and spot symptoms like that. And I also think that honestly, John, I think this is a topic that it requires a deeper level of handling from line managers, and the education and awareness has got to be there, but also the overall framework of a company. If we really think about well-being, and I don't want it to go the way we have now with the backlash with DEI, but I think it does have to be at the C-suite level, and accountability and responsibility has to reside there.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I agree with that. And I was just thinking while you were speaking, I think as lawyers, sometimes often you deal with the harder edge of trying to get people back to work and almost punishing them sometimes on behalf of employers for being off work. And I think what you're talking about is some form of corporate empathy. If we summarize everything that we're talking about in the last half an hour or so, it's about a drive towards more corporate empathy, where you're wanting the board and C-suite to have front of mind workplace wellness issues. You're wanting to equip line managers to have the knowledge to be more intuitive and empathetic about the people who they manage, and in so doing create an environment where hopefully, if there's more awareness of burnout and these sorts of issues, you will have lower levels of absences and higher levels of productivity. So we will probably try and put together as some sort of template an empathy document, John and Amanda's empathy document. And if we wrote something like that, we could encourage employers as a whole to do that.
I just want to say one thing, because I think you're so right. I mean, I don't want to trivialize empathy, but it is that, because burnout is not a personal flaw; it's a workplace design flaw. And I think that burnout, isn't about balance. It's also about belonging and feeling that you can actually be supported in telling employees that I'm going through something tough and I need help here, feeling trusted and supported. So I also think that is empathy at the end of the day, and I think that is really critical to what we've been talking about.
Thank you very much indeed. So I didn't think when we started this, I thought this was too difficult a nut to crack, but there we go. Within 30 minutes or so, we've gone a long way to solving Britain's productivity crisis. So we're going to wrap up now. Thank you very much indeed. We will see you in a month's time. We might get another external speaker to speak then. We hope the listeners have enjoyed listening to this. We are genuinely looking for engagement among the HR community, among the legal community, among employers, and from employees and unions, etc., to see what they think about this. If you've got better ideas than the ones we have come up with tentatively today, then please come forward. We'll adopt those and we'll aggregate them together. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.